Checking for levels. Gaff. You good? All right. Okay, so stories. So I'm gonna jump off from where Eileen left and give a little some historical stories that are true, quite true. And one of them funny. So Eileen was talking about Miss Aki, who lived next to the lake's house. So if you go to Sandy Ground today and you visit you see where the police station sits, there was an old house that belonged to Captain Orlando Lake. And Captain Orlando Lake was an extremely gifted sailor. He was reputed to be able to reverse a schooner. Now, if you know if you follow boats or if you go inside in the little room, you will see a replica of the Warspite. In the old days, in the latter days of the schooners, they would have engines. But in the early days, they would have no engines at all. It's a sailing boat. Now, it's very, very, very hard to reverse a sailing boat. Extremely difficult. But Captain Orlando Lake was reputed to be able to go to a place like St. Bart's, where there was a lot of schooners, because if you turn the clock back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, St. Bart's was a major area for you to go and get supplies. Something like after the revolution, you'd go to Puerto Rico to get all your building materials. Well, in the early days, you'd go to St. Bart's to get all your rope, all your sails, all things like that. Is that Chloe? So he would take the Esme. His famous schooner was the Esme, and he could anchor the Esme in St. Bart's, break out the anchor, and reverse out through a whole bunch of other schooners from all over the Caribbean. So he was a master sailor. Anyhow, again, backing off of what Eileen was talking about, he was married to a lady called Miss Buddy. And Miss Buddy was nothing easy. She was a terror. And Captain Lake was famous for, he couldn't take it anymore. He would jump in a little rowing boat late at night and row out to any one of his sloops and go on board to catch a sleep, because he couldn't take any more. But on this famous trip, now remember, back up, remember, a schooner has, like every other ship across the world, has a captain, and then the person right behind him is the mate, all right? In a big sloop, big boat, you have first mate, second mate. But in our schooners days, it's just a mate. Now, you also had a cook, because our schooners went all through the Caribbean. And the cook was never really a big shot on a schooner. A schooner usually had like 9 crew members. So it was the captain, then the mate, then the bosun, then the deckhands, and then the cook. So anyway, there was this famous trip when Captain Lake had to go to St. Kitts to pick up Miss Buddy. And on his way back to Anguilla, Miss Buddy got seasick. Now, in the old days, the main cabin, you'll see it on the Warspite in there, there was a big cabin just in front of the wheel where you could have 3 or 4 bunks. And they were relatively comfortable. Nothing on a schooner was comfortable, but they were relatively comfortable. So Miss Buddy was down there seasick. And Miss Buddy insisted that Captain Orlando Lake, who everybody called Captain Lanny, come downstairs and fan her. So this famous sailor had to sit down inside the cabin with some kind of, I have to pause, this is our beloved little granddaughter who's coming with her mom, Carrie, and this is our sparkle. Her name is Chloe, and she's here with Ganji. Anyway, so they had to fan Miss Buddy. So the Esme came around below Sandy Anguilita, and then she was tacking up, just like in a boat race, to come into Sandy Ground. And when she was coming into Sandy Ground, well, let me back up. If you go up to South Hill today and stand on South Hill and look out, you will see a little island west of Sandy Island. Check it out when next you go. That little island is called Tom Downing. Now, prior to 1968, it was not an island. Prior to 1968, it was just a shoal, and it was called Dowling Shoal. And it was kind of dangerous because it was hard to see, but it was a shoal. In 1968, there was a horrific groundswell, and next morning, boom, there was a little island, and it's still there. Anyhow, the Esme was coming up on attack, and the mate was steering the vessel. And the mate completely messed up and ran the Esme straight up onto Dowling Shoal. Brugadoops. Luckily for the vessel, the shoal was all sand, so the vessel wasn't damaged. Even with that disaster, so the story goes, Captain Lake could not leave Miss Buddy and had to stay down below and fan her. In a fury, the cook came out of the galley, marched to the back of the vessel, slapped off the mate, pushed the mate away from the wheel, took command of the vessel, told the sailors what to do, the cook, and slowly but surely, the Esme was able to back off the shoal. They got her off, back into Sandy Ground. By the next day, Angola's best calypsonian, a fellow named Wally Hughes from Sandy Ground, had a calypso out. And the verse of the calypso was, the mate put her on and the cook took her off. Fan me, Lanny, fan me. So, true story. So that's the first one. So, and the truth is, there are a lot of stories about that Calypsonians. Again, it's when you hear the Calypsonians talking about that, it shows you the influence of boats and the sea on our culture at that time. Another crazy one. So we used to smuggle. Right? Anguillians are famous for smuggling. The truth is, if you smuggle nowadays, you're just wicked or worthless. But in the old days, you had to smuggle to survive because of the jollification, because you had to mine, you had to work on the land to make ends meet. You had to get your friends and neighbors to come and help you plow up the land and get a pigeon peas planted or corn planted. And how did you pay them? You couldn't pay them with money. You had to pay them with food and, most importantly, rum or gin or cheap French wine. So what the St. Kitts government used to do was they would hire a customs officer who was always as well, or not always, but usually as well, the doctor. So you would send a medical officer from St. Kitts who also had to become a policeman, in effect. So one medical officer who became a policeman, He was a doctor in the day, a policeman at night. He used to coop the smugglers, because what the smugglers used to do was the smugglers would come into places like Little Harbor, the Cove, Rendezvous, and if you turn the clock back at the old Anguilla racing boat, not the modern Anguillan racing boat with all the fancy rigs, but in the old Anguilla racing boat, the spar was put up with only 3 ropes. And the reason for that is that you could drop the mast very quickly. So what the smugglers used to do, they would come in, and before the boat would go into the wind, when a sailing boat goes into the wind, the sails luff. But when the sails luff, they flap, 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 flap. So you can hear it. So what they used to do is come in and loose up the tack which is the rope that holds the sail going down to the bow, and they drop the rig down quick, right? So in this case, this doctor would dress up, the women, the Anguillan women now would be there, ready as soon as the boat hit the beach, sail down, you would run into the sea, you would take out your demijohn of wine, your demijohn of gin, your demijohn of rum, your sack of flour, and you hustle to push it up in the bush behind a grape tree, right? That's the way I smuggled to duck what was called a revenue officer. So in this case, this doctor used to wear a dress. He used to dress up like a woman and coop the smugglers. They will feel now that was a... But they caught him as usual. As usual, they found out who he was. And again, Wally Hughes would strike. Dr. Button was here. He had to cry for his wife. Dr. Jones was here. He had to run for his life. Now Dr. Trestrail come, he running wrong with his gun, but one of these nights we're going to make such a fight, that son of a gun got to run. So you hear the calypsos again, you hear everything following on to the culture. So those were true but funny days. And the smugglers were smart, especially in Little Harbor. If you go down to Little Harbor today, you see all the reefs. It's a very, very difficult harbor to come into. In the old days, you didn't have half as many of the reefs. The reefs have grown over the years. But what some of the smugglers used to do, there's some little caves all in Lockram and Little Harbor that you can't see from the land. You can only see the caves if you're at the sea. So they would light fires in strategic places in the caves, and if they would light the fires in such a way that if you're out at sea, you will see like two fires. But if you go up and down until the two fires lined up to one, that would be the channel. So they were able now to tack and come, follow the lights in, and boom. So these were how some of the smugglers used to do. Now, there were a lot of sad stories. A lot of Anguillians lost their lives at sea. Again, it speaks to culture. Again,